On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we're joined by the author of Zen Economics, Rob Urie.
Consumer culture has been created, and people take consumer culture and their desire for consumer goods as being natural and something that is coming outside of themselves, when in fact there was an entire industry devoted to creating consumer culture, consciously creating consumer culture.
On Contact, neoliberalism is patriotism. Truth is not. Socialism is class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism revolts en masse. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Capitalism is, to most of us, about consumption. It is about mass-produced consumer products, cars, houses, clothes, electronics, or processed foods. But capitalism brings with it other products: global warming, dying oceans, poisoned air and water, corporate-controlled systems of governance and power, dislocations of communities, and grotesque income inequality. Capitalism is an ideology. The power of this ideology is so fierce that most of us can envision the collapse of the ecosystem before we can envision the collapse of capitalism. During capitalism's breakdown in the 1930s, New Deal programs provided jobs, and programs such as Social Security. These programs saved capitalism from itself. But in the new round of capitalist distress, the resources of the government have been used not to address the suffering caused by capitalism, but to reviving Wall Street and the financial firms that are responsible for the global meltdown. How can political solutions emerge from this closed system, one designed to serve Wall Street? How are we going to find our way out of the capitalist labyrinth? Anya Parampil examines the huge disparities in wealth that define our system of neo-feudalism.
From a young age, those in the United States are taught the tale of the American dream, that anyone from any class can work just hard enough to provide a better life for their children by earning a middle-class income. However, the numbers show that dream is a fantasy. That's because the middle class is shrinking. Over the past 3 decades, the group of Americans earning what is considered a middle-class income has declined from 56.5% to 45.1%. But it's not as though the middle class is just mysteriously disappearing because America's not rich anymore. The wealth just isn't flowing to the middle class. This year, a Pew Research study of 229 metropolitan American areas found that since the turn of the century, the percentage of Americans earning middle-class wages fell in 203 areas. Yet meanwhile, those making lower income grew in 160 areas, and those making upper income grew in 172. In other words, if the middle class is dissipating in the United States, then class divides are strengthening. But what does being middle class even mean? According to Pew, a single American who makes as low as $24,000 but up to $72,000 a year is middle class, while for a family of 4, that ranges from $48,000 to $144,000. So maybe Americans just aren't producing and the economy isn't growing, you might say, but that's not the case. In fact, over the same period of time, the middle class has declined. Productivity in the United States has increased. As a result, the average income of the top 1% of society has skyrocketed. Meanwhile, overall wages have stagnated. So the economy is working, in fact, exactly the way it's supposed to. But if the result of that is a decaying middle class and the intensification of class divides, then the question is, who was it designed to work for?
Rob Urie is a writer, artist, and political activist. He's the author of Zen Economics, which you can buy on Counterpunch, that argues that the systems in place are not only incapable of solving the problems we face, but will make them worse. We will build a fundamentally different approach to the world around us, he argues, or become victims of capitalism itself. Welcome.
Thank you.
In your book, you talk about capitalism, as Marx did, as an ideology. And you talk about the creation of economic man or economic woman. What do you mean by that?
Capitalism is a particular type of ideology where an Italian theorist, Antonio Gramsci, came up with the idea of hegemony, which is a deeply buried ideology that supports the dominant interests in a society. And so one of the reasons why capitalism has been so successful is because it's an instantiated ideology. And people take it as a natural way of being in the world and a natural way of relating, and take consumption, particularly American-type consumption, which is spreading the globe, as a natural way of existing.
And I think you argue quite persuasively that it's not natural at all because one has to be conditioned, this is what you mean by the economic man or economic woman, into the system. And explain that idea.
Well, that's one of the major points that I was trying to make, and Noam Chomsky deals with it a bit in his writing, Manufacturing Consent, and so there are a lot of ideas around this, but basically consumer culture has been created. And people take consumer culture and their desire for consumer goods as being natural and something that is coming outside of themselves, when in fact there was an entire industry devoted to creating consumer culture, consciously creating consumer culture, that was essentially American. Edward Bernays
and
was...
corporate.
And corporate, exactly. It was the integration of psychology with corporate desire.
Right, and I think you could actually argue that the values weren't American at all, because if you go back to Bernays and those people who used crowd psychology, the understanding of Freud, Le Bon, Trotter, to make consumption an inner compulsion, they had to overturn traditional values of thrift, self-effacement, and replace it with the hedonism, the cult of the self, and alienation.
I have a slightly different take. I believe that it's a little bit deeper than that, in the sense that Edward Bernays worked in conjunction with corporations to use psychology to create consumer culture, but it wasn't apart and aside from the traditional American thrift that would have been put forward in Protestantism and...
well, that goes back to Weber. We won't go into that argument.
Yeah, yes.
But if you do look, for instance, at the 1970s, you have, very few people, for instance, had credit cards. That there has been a conditioning in terms of debt peonage. And when you talk about the economic man or the economic woman, what you're really saying is that these are, are unnatural profiles of human beings that are created in order to force them to fit into a system. Would that be correct?
I would call it more engineered. The idea of nature and what's natural and what's unnatural is difficult to unpack, because here we are, and our ways of being in the world are essentially natural in their various incarnations. But it is an engineered way of relating to the world and to each other. And this goes back to early ideas of capitalism and some of the major points that I try to make in the book, which are to really ask the questions: how did we get from there to here? What deep type of philosophy and ideology would contribute to making the modern understanding of the world, modern consumer culture, feasible and rational in any sense? And so one of the purposes of the book is to go through the philosophy and the philosophical history that contributes to this radical alienation, I call it. And that sounds like just terminology until you really get to where that's coming from and why it might be plausible from a philosophical perspective.
Well, one of the points you make is that you around this ideology, you define the success or the achievements of capitalism based on certain products but not on others, or certain consequences and not on others.
This is absolutely essential to understanding capitalism. When people look at capitalism and conceive it from their inner selves, what they're looking at really are the bright, shiny objects, the cars, the flat screen TVs, the obvious stuff of capitalism. But what they're not saying is that these objects, these consumer goods, are indissociable from the environmental crises that they're causing. And the approach to the world, the way of relating to the world that is this radical alienation, ties capitalism and capitalist production to nuclear weapons. And
or to imperialism.
Or to imperialism, in that there's this distance that's created through philosophy and through the approach to the world that is capitalism, and that's also a part of capitalism that keeps us apart from each other, and that leads to the inability to rectify the excesses of capitalism, the intended consequences.
Well, that's the bedrock of the consumer culture. Alienation is the bedrock of the consumer culture, the identification with brands. You use a term, capitalism as scientific production. What do you mean by that?
Well, people tend to see economics, political philosophy, and science as being separate ways of seeing the world. And the philosophy that I try to take apart and make obvious in the book ties science to capitalism. Capitalism is a way of efficiently, at least in theory, producing consumer goods.
Now, let me just say, isn't science, in essence, morally neutral? And it serves interests. In this case, most scientists work for corporations or the defense industry, and in a sense, it is what science serves.
That's exactly what I was trying to get behind in the book, and I take great issue with that view of the world, that science is politically, philosophically neutral. And this is a difficult path to go down on television, because it takes 250 pages in the book to unpack, essentially. But the approach to the world that is science, it comes from the same approach to the world that is capitalism, and it's this radical alienation that comes through philosophically the philosophy of René Descartes, French philosopher, that looks at the world from a theoretical inside and approaches the world as something to be acted on rather than participated in. There's this philosophical difference that's created, and again, this takes a bit of work to unpack, but the same distance that's behind economic man and the approach to the world that is, in modern terms, consumer society, is behind science. In that it's a way of looking at the world from outside of it, from an inside, a philosophical inside that's created.
We'll come back to that. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we'll hear more from Rob Urie.
For decades, the American middle class has been railroaded by Washington politics. Big money corporate interest has drowned out a lot of voices. That's how it is in the news culture in this country now. That's where I come in. I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. I'll make sure you don't get railroaded, and you'll get the straight talk and the straight news. Question more.
About your sudden passing, I've only just learned. You wore yourself thin, taking your last wrong turn. Your act got up to you as we all knew it would. I'd tell you I'm sorry, if only I could. So I write these last words in hopes to put to rest these things that I never got off my chest. I remember when we first met, my life turned on each breath. But then my feelings started to change. You talked about war like it was a game. Still, some were fond of you, those that didn't like to question or argue. And I secretly promised to never be like you. It's said one does not leave a funeral the same as one enters. The mind gets consumed with death, but this one quite differs. I speak to you now because there were no other takers. To proclaim that mainstream media has met its maker.
What politicians do is something we don't do. They put themselves on the line, and they get accepted or rejected. So when you want to be president, why would you want to be? Why would someone want to be president? What's it like to be president? What's it like when the phone rings at 3 in the morning? Can't be a good call. I'm interested always in the whys and the hows. And Q Larry. Question more. Ed, if this were a job application, isn't Hillary the most qualified ever?
You know, if you're looking for someone in government, there's never been anyone so qualified. But on the other hand, if you're looking for somebody in business, which is attracting to a lot of Americans, you might have a very most qualified candidate in Donald Trump. Why do you think he's gone so far?
He caught a tiger by the tail, had opponents who fell quickly, and then he caught catchphrases for each of them. He taught you to fixate on them. And this guy's lying, this guy's cheating, and it worked.
How can Hillary lose?
She would be a prohibitive favorite, but favorites lose. Never say never.
Follow the 2016 campaigns right here on RT America.
And question more.
On Contact with Chris Hedges.
Welcome back to On Contact. Today I'm joined by author of Zen Economics, Rob Urie. So we were speaking before the break about science. And we won't get into this argument as to whether science has the capacity to recognize the sacred, although I think that it does. But certainly we both agree that science has been harnessed to capitalism in a very self-destructive way, whether that is, as you mentioned before, the creation of nuclear weapons, the sophisticated techniques, fracking, etc., by which we extract diminishing resources that accelerate the assault on the environment. You speak throughout the book about climate change and how it's intimately tied now to this self-destructive quality that is endemic to capitalism, especially expressed now globally.
The question back really is, how is it possible to resolve climate change, global warming, and I would add nuclear weapons to that. And I read a lot, I listen to a lot of opinions on these issues, and my argument in the book that I go through the background philosophy to try to make is that without fundamentally reconsidering the way that we relate to the world, which would be a reconsideration of capitalism and really modern life.
Could we break it down to say the capacity to honor the sacred, which we've lost?
Yeah, I think that that's a useful way of putting it, in the sense that it removes the distance, if you will. The sacred is something that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that would be a part of the way that we relate to the world that's either conscious or unconscious.
It's as if life has an intrinsic value that can't be measured in monetary terms.
99.9% of world history is relating to the world without the medium of money in between us and the world. And if we look at where the environmental destruction of global warming is coming from, you can tie it in geography and history very specifically to industrial capitalism.
Yeah, you make this point. It was a good point.
And
and you talk about how if we look now at what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, if we were to draw a map of this, it completely replicates imperialistic structures.
It does. History is embedded. And one of the problems with economics, or one of the challenges that it poses, is that it puts economic theory in the ever-present, where these historical relationships are persistent and they're embedded and people live their lives through them. And so economic theory cannot count what's taken away, such as indigenous ways of relating and indigenous economies that I believe would tie to the notion of the sacred that you're talking about, in the sense that there's a direct relation between the people and each other, and a direct relation between the people and the way that they get by in the world that's developed through history.
Let me ask about, and you also bring this up in the book, the mechanisms by which capitalism once regulated itself. The New Deal, with the breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s perhaps being the most dramatic example, and that essentially we've lost that mechanism.
This is one of the most interesting points about the current epoch, is that I'm old enough to remember other ways of seeing the world, particularly Keynesian ways of seeing the world. And coming out of the crisis of 2008 and 2009, my working premise was that we were going to reconsider what capitalism is and use a number of the strategies that had worked in bringing the West out of the Great Depression, so that we wouldn't go into these catastrophic social dysfunctions that the 20th century saw so much of. And we truly have moved past, in time and space and our understanding of history, the methods and modes of resolving these problems. And so what's come back out of this is the most radical version of capitalism that we've seen since before the Great Depression, neoliberalism. I would
completely utopian, because it's not, as you point out, connected to our economic reality in any way.
It's a philosophy of the ruling elite, and I would argue that neoliberalism is pre-Great Depression economics. There are a number of theorists who argue that it's a completely new thing, but I would tie it in history to pre-Great Depression economics and ask really what happened to understanding and knowledge of the Great Depression.
What do you mean by that? Why do you tie it to that, and what are the similarities?
The philosophy, there are a number of technical issues, such as the government's incapacity to...
this is Hoover.
This is Hoover, exactly, and it's pre-Hoover as well. There was an interesting back and forth in the early days of the Great Depression. But it's also a philosophy of the world where you've got a ruling elite, and there's this self-justification, which it comes through societal rewards, who's connected and who isn't. So upper class, ruling class leaders can look at their classmates and say, through the logic of capitalism, that we've earned this, that we deserve it. And so there's this self-legitimating aspect of capitalism that's absolutely socially catastrophic. Because what it essentially is saying that everybody in the world is perfectly ordered, and that everybody in the world is in their place. And this is a Victorian view of the world. And
well, it's the just world theory. Everybody gets what they deserve, which is Victorian.
Which is Victorian, exactly. And when you actually go through the mechanisms of economic distribution, I call it state capitalism in my other writing, but it's this integrated state ruling class relationship where pharmaceutical companies, military companies, oil and gas companies depend on their relationship with the government, and the leaders in the government depend on their relationship with these industries. And so it's explained in a superficial sense as a revolving door between government and industry. but it was fairly well explained. The State and Revolution by Lenin is a brilliant book that lays out well over a century ago, well, approximately a century ago, how this relationship of state and capitalism comes to be. What's truly crazy is the ideology that says that, that government's the problem, and this theory of natural distribution, given how integrated.
Well, you talk a lot about why that is, and you bring up the loss of credibility that the government has. You focus on the Vietnam War, as well as a series of laws, many of them passed by Bill Clinton, that essentially made war on the underclass, that this eroded confidence that people had in the government and allowed ideologues like Reagan to appear and essentially tarnish government, which is the only mechanism we have to control the power of corporate capital, to tarnish the role of government within the society.
That's an excellent explanation of what it is that I was trying to get at. I lived through this. I saw the tax revolts of the 1970s that were used to defund public schools, and I saw the growth of the ideology of the radical right, and it came through discrediting government. And what people point to when they want to discredit government is this government corporate nexus. They look at the corruption of government that comes through the revolving door, but more generally through the close relationship between business and government, government support for business, and they say that government is intrinsically corrupt, when in fact there are different forms of social organization through history. Government isn't intrinsically corrupt. We need a fundamental rethinking of our relationships to one another so that we can make government.
No, we've undergone, I think, as John Rosenthal has said, a corporate coup d'etat. And this is why, as repugnant as Donald Trump may be, and as vile as a Hillary Clinton is, it isn't going to make any difference, because that's not where the center of power lies. We see it with Obama. These are political faces. I want to raise an issue that I thought was quite thoughtful on your point. You say, and I agree with you, that we actually aren't going to create another alternative to neoliberalism and global capitalism until the breakdown of capitalism itself, because the ideology is so ingrained, so embedded within public consciousness, within every institution, from academia to the press. Of course, with the breakdown, it may be too late, given global warming, to save ourselves. But I think you're right on that, and I want you to talk a little bit about that idea.
Well, really the purpose of the book was to provide a path to a different way of relating to the world. And my way of understanding is to go through philosophy, through these different ideas, social philosophy, existential philosophy, et cetera, to try to understand the world and understand how we got from there to here. And the problem that I see with trying to attack capitalism is it comes through this deep instantiation. We're a century into the creation of consumer culture, and people take their ways of seeing the world as being self-generated. And the question back is, if they are self-generated, why do so many people think the same things? Why do what most people believe most of the time?
But you argue, we have to wrap it up here, but you argue that this ideology is now so dominant that essentially it's shut down the ability for us to think in alternative forms.
I think that the ability is still there. Hegemonic in the Gramscian sense is the way that I would frame how deeply embedded it is, but I believe the capacity is still there. I'm meeting people all over the place who have been thrown outside of what they thought was their place in capitalist culture, and so I think there's a growing realization.
And thank you to my guest, author of Zen Economics, Rob Urie. Civilizations careening towards collapse create ever more complex structures and more intricate specialization to exploit diminishing resources. But eventually the resources are destroyed or exhausted. the systems and technologies designed to exploit these resources become useless. The result is systems collapse. The capitalist elites are trained in business schools and managerial programs not to solve real problems, but to maintain at any cost the systems of global capitalism. They are systems managers. They know only how to serve the system. They amass inconceivable sums of wealth, while their victims, the underclass around the globe, are thrust into increasing distress from global warming, poverty, and societal breakdown. The apparatus of government seized by the corporate cabal is hostile to genuine reform or change. Hope comes from the attempts to dismantle the system of corporate capitalism, not the attempts to accommodate it. Thank you for watching On Contact. You can find us at rt.com/oncontact. See you next week.